just to introduce the talk, this is the first part of a double header in a way, with the talk next week from Rival Strategies. Victoria and Ben, I'll say a little bit more in a brief introduction biography in the end, but they've both been working with and at the Serpentine on thinking about art ecologies, which is to say the art system, the art infrastructures. And they were working on this for quite a while. And I kind of got to know about the project towards the end of last year. And what Victoria and Ben and Rival as consultants to this project, what they were interested in was the kind of systemic vulnerabilities and systemic dysfunctionality of the art organizations and the art system as a whole. And we know some of that through the kind of things that we've talked about for a long time on the program, about the kind of high degree of concentration of capital and visibility in the art world, the kind of difficulties of career paths, for example, the kind of fragility and precarity of the art career across the board, not just for artists, but across the board, and also the kind of very low levels of capital that generally circulate through the art system, all of which make it extremely difficult to be an artist, a curator, a writer, and so on. So, of course, the art system ends up exploiting the enthusiasms and love people have for art and for being artists and for ideas and the rest of it, while at the same time amassing quite a lot of wealth, reputational wealth, as well as financial wealth in very, very small pockets of it. So that's a kind of very large overview of one of the many dysfunctionalities of the art system. Victoria's already shaking her head as a kind of, she's going to negate everything I've just said. But we also know there are many others around the social circuit, the way that artists are selected, the way exhibitions happen, the way profiles are written up, the way reputation circulates, and so on. We don't really need very many reminders of that. So this was the kind of medium-term standing project that Victoria and Ben initiated through the Serpentine, and it was going to produce a report. It has produced a report trying to redress these dysfunctionalities, vulnerabilities, and precarity in the art system in certain ways, especially in view of changing technologies and what that means to standard exhibition structures. And then, of course, the virus hit, and then the lockdown happened, and many of the recommendations in the report, it seemed to me, took a new salience, had a new meaning, and a new kind of gave new lessons, or kind of the lessons that it was giving us took on a new meaning and a new specificity, I think, because of the common reaction that nothing stays the same after the pandemic. And the question that throws up is, well, what will be the new thing? What are going to be the new structures? What are going to be the new processes? What are going to be the new mechanisms, I guess, through which the kinds of things that we try to do can happen? And this takes a particular aspect or particular configuration in the art system. So I very much wanted to invite Victoria and Ben and Rival to come in and reflect upon I guess, the work that they did coming up to the Future Art Ecologies report, which we'll probably speak about a bit more next week, and what's happened to it since then, given the pandemic, and also whether they see what they see is happening to the medium and long-term structure and ecology of the art system. So we can have, sorry, so some things just collapsed outside. What they see has happening to the medium and long-term ecology and structure of the art system, because that's where artistic careers take place. So just as a biographical introduction, Victoria is a PhD student at South Bank University, and she's, as I said, she's been working with Ben and with the Serpentine on a general thinking. I think maybe you'll introduce this, Victoria, the work that you've been doing there. But there's been a kind of consideration about what new technologies, digital technologies, and digital exhibition structures mean for art organizations. And this kind of continues long-standing work of Victoria's on art systems and how to think of art systemically, which is one of the issues that we were also talking about in the first term. Ben Vickers is the Chief Technology Officer at the Serpentine, I'm assured that means more than he takes care of all the video projections. Ben's actually working quite hard to find a strategy for the Serpentine and, by extension, other art organizations to think about what they do in terms of digital production and digital exhibition. And he's also the, I think he runs or is the editor of Ignota Press, and he claims in his biography to be a Luddite, but I don't believe him. So I think that's enough for the introductions. Do you guys want to? Oh, so just before Ben and Victoria start, we're going to run this through a screen share, and if that doesn't work, then we also have the Google Doc available, and I'll send the link out if we need to, as we did with Prem last week. All right, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction and for having us. Me and Victoria, I don't think we've done a presentation together before, so we've color-coded our deck so that hopefully this will hold together, but it's obviously like a new undertaking. Victoria, do you want to say hi?
Yeah, just thank you so much for the introduction, Suhail, and for inviting us to speak here. Just as a way of kind of introducing this talk, we wanted to quickly introduce where both of us are coming from. Although these are, as you'll see, they're slightly distinct places, they somehow merge at a logical intersection, which we'll hopefully explain throughout the talk. But for me personally, I've got a background in human rights, so that's kind of where I started out professionally, which very much informs my approach to the art field in terms of really seeing the art field as sort of part of like a larger systemic reality, which is kind of shaping the way that politics works, geopolitics works, what kind of philosophical ideals are seen as the norm, and what sort of progress is possible. At the same time, I think kind of my background in the legal sphere sort of really also informs how I approach the type of curatorial work that I do. So I'm more interested in kind of curating, let's say, the organizational dimension of the art field than just sort of necessarily doing curating at the level of exhibition making or kind of more public-facing components. To this extent, I mean, a really long time ago, 12 years ago now, I founded a center in East Ukraine in a city called Donetsk, which is now a disputed territory between Russia and Ukraine, a cultural center at the intersection of civil society, activism, and contemporary culture. And I won't say much about that, but I guess what has also been formative about that experience is just a general interest about how the art field has a role to play in other fields, particularly in fields that are kind of shaping our societies. So I was always interested in thinking through that interface between contemporary culture and external fields, like at a very kind of practical, material level. To this extent, a couple of years ago, 2017, together with a couple of colleagues, and actually Suhail was also involved, I curated a fellowship program in Miami called the Recalibrated Institution. And I brought together various practitioners, from artists to art critics, to theorists, to curators, who were starting to develop a kind of a practice that tried to work at the organizational, operational level of the art field, rather than just sort of only in terms of producing outputs that are to be, shown in museums and art spaces and kind of on the stage of the contemporary art field. And that has been a very formative experience, sort of, and further, that's dictating the pathway of my curatorial practice, which has now kind of landed within this practice-based PhD program that I am doing with Serpentine Galleries and the London South Bank University. So it's a practice-based PhD that's looking at the question of infrastructural development, particularly where art intersects with advanced technologies. And so it started from using the work that Ben and his team at the Serpentine have been developing to think through the R&D platform to that work, which we'll be talking about later. So as I started doing the practice-based PhD, which was really trying to prototype the different type of curatorial practice to the one that we have established within the art field, but for which there were no job applications as of yet, or just job openings. Basically trying to kind of shape a type of curatorial practice that works at this organizational development level, and with the ultimate ambition of replicating that experiment, and for that kind of role becoming really a type of curatorial practice that can be present at different organizations, not just the Serpentine. So to this extent, I'm also kind of working on a freelance basis with the Serpentine as the R&D lead, and that will become a bit more apparent what that means as we describe later in the talk, what the R&D platform at the Serpentine looks like.
Yeah, so by way of giving a kind of introduction to my background, I always keep my biography very small, condensed, and don't tend to kind of give background on what I've done in the past. But I think for this talk, and to kind of understand why we might be coming at it from this perspective, I think it's perhaps valuable to cite previous work. So when I went to art school. Whilst I was at art school, I worked for the B-Sky B, the corporation, television, Rupert Murdoch, developing a data mining project. And this was at the time where the only other data mining project that existed was Amazon. And so at about the age of like 17, 18, I learned an enormous amount about how different data strategies would shape organizations. And so that awareness is what informs a lot of my work going forward. Following that, I did a number of different things, but I think one that's quite relevant to thinking through organizational design is I worked on a project with the Council of Europe called Edge Riders, which was taking network analysis as a methodology in order to build online communities as a kind of distributed think tank. So that meant bringing together like kind of vast numbers of random niche kind of groups from across the internet onto a single platform and kind of synthesizing an organization out of that process. That then led to the development of our monastery, which was an attempt to produce a new type of localized kind of policy instrument for small cities, which, you know, had varying success, and this talk isn't about that. And more recently, I've been with the Serpentine now for about 7 years, and worked as, I came on as a digital curator. That was one of the first times that term was kind of used. And then as the organization kind of changed and new leadership came in, there was the opportunity to kind of shift that into a kind of more executive organizational management level. I'm not going to talk about specifically what that role is at this point, but what I am going to lay out in this talk is the kind of underlying strategy that informed the kind of organizational redesign that we've been attempting. Do you want to start on this one?
Sure. Yeah, so what we wanted to talk about, there's really kind of two parts to our talk today. So the first part is kind of trying to explain the rationale behind sort of the strategy that we've been trying to implement through the Serpentine effectively as a type of experiment. And just sort of thinking on a higher level about why we chose that particular approach, which we'll be explaining in a second. And then the second part of the talk will kind of look at COVID as a certain moment that has larger scale repercussions, which are already quite evident, both for the art field, but also for how the art field relates to the field of technology at large, but specifically where technology informs the way that geopolitics and governance are going to be structured. So I think, you know, we decided to kind of be very open about all of our thinking, and I think kind of this level of honesty isn't maybe something we would have typically done. We would have probably presented more our work, etc. But here we just wanted to be like very clear about why we did what we did in terms of like higher level rationales. So I think both Ben and I kind of were in agreement from the very start when I started doing the PhD, and probably, you know, this is where our paths intersect, is that there's a lot of kind of talk in the art field about transformation and kind of progress and progressive ideals is a really kind of important dimension of how the art field identifies itself. Yet at the kind of practical level of implementing change on the level of operations, there isn't really necessarily that expertise, nor is there necessarily that much effort in that direction. So it seemed that taking kind of the path of reformism or reforming certain aspects of cultural institutions, the cultural field at large, was an interesting route to take if we started to sort of really kind of being accountable to the larger scale ideals and progressive values that we were, as a field, kind of proclaiming on a discursive level. With this kind of reformist attitude comes a series of, let's say, subcategories of tactics, which maybe then we'll kind of continue exploring, such as leveraging, translating logics from other fields with greater systemic efficacy into the art field, and seeking generative hybridity rather than critical art purity. Ben, maybe it makes sense if you talk about leveraging a little bit, because this is something that has been really kind of core to how you work. So, and then I'll move to other subtopics.
Yeah, I think the thing that I would add there is, I think there's like a deep awareness in our work of, the kind of inherent contradiction and what many people would refer to as kind of problematic. But I think that what's important right now is understanding that institutions are in a moment of significant flux, and there are opportunities that need to kind of be moved upon if those institutions are to kind of reform and have other functions going into the future. And so in terms of, I guess, the way that we use the term leverage or think about it from a strategic perspective is that there are certain affordances, certain networks, certain affiliations and forms of status that are present inside institutions, such as the Serpentine, that can be used to develop new types of relationships and also platform different types of function. I mean, the basic example there is that because the Serpentine tends to be kind of at the leading edge of a lot of different discourses, practices, etc., a lot of that essentially is copied by other institutions. So the Serpentine is a site for a new type of kind of institutional experiment is like interesting in that respect, and that's not necessarily within just the kind of artistic field, but at a kind of policy level, etc. So why the strategy at the Serpentine? I think I just kind of say very briefly. I figure that most people, if you're at Goldsmiths, that you're familiar with it as an institution. Like the artistic director is Hans-Ulrich Obrist. Hans-Ulrich has been kind of critical to shaping the curator as we know it today. It's also an institution that internationally, its physical footprint is not representative of its influence. And that partly comes out of quite an extreme mode of production, which is probably best exemplified by the building of a pavilion every year. And that serves as like an interesting project within the history of the Serpentine for its ambition, but perhaps also like a degree of insanity. So there's a kind of openness to trying things that are highly risky and are interesting. I think the other thing that is important to state is that the Serpentine also sits at the intersection of many, many different networks. If you look across our board, if you look at the different groups that support us, and then you look at the program, particularly around issues of social justice, etc. And if you've been paying attention, reputationally and some of the things that have been difficult for the Serpentine over the course of the last year, it's evident that in a moment of kind of flux and significant friction and conflict, that a place that brings together all of these different elements is inevitably going to be under fire. But that is also the reason why it's interesting to attempt to build within this space. And in terms of kind of what this talk's really going to be focused on, specifically art and technology, and specifically art and advanced technology. And I'll get to kind of explaining what that strategy has kind of looked like over the course of the last 5 years. But I think that it's also important to highlight the sorts of things that we've seen emerging in the last few years, and as a result of this strategy, anticipated. And this is work that very much informs the development of the Future Art Ecosystems report. So this first example is, if everybody's not familiar with Team Lab, it is a kind of artist collective company / corporation of about 500 individuals that both run a profitable business that's then been pivoted into a kind of art production house that last year created a museum that, back of the envelope estimations, probably made over 100 million. So it also presents like a highly disruptive model to how we understand the museum. Pace Gallery is launching Pace X. This is going through some kind of iterations at the moment, but this is a project that's, I guess, kind of learning from Team Lab in terms of a business model that can function a slightly different way to museums have historically, and it sits at this kind of intersection between the kind of theme park, city design, and large-scale artist projects. In this same kind of vein, we saw last year the launch of Apple's augmented reality tours, which I think particularly interesting for considering the kind of existential position of institutions right now. Although there was a kind of a sort of tangential partnership with the new museum in New York when they launched the tours in other cities, they actually didn't involve any institutions or anything that would, typically be part of the kind of art world as many of us know it. And then there's this kind of migration that's beginning, that's perhaps like signaled best by Daniel Birnbaum's move as the artistic director to become the artistic director of acute art from Moderna in Stockholm. And then I think just wanted to also highlight a few other examples that we've had some experience with. The instance of things like BTS and K-pop as a sort of soft power cultural strategy that Korea has been developing over the course of 20 or 30 years. And I think important to consider, particularly in light of the fact that, if you look at the kind of soft power cultural strategies of the UK, and other countries in Europe, you see like somehow lacking. If you look at the kind of detail of BTS, you see a very, very high level of sophistication in terms of organizational design, movement development, the way that tech corporations and kind of elite functions within a country intersect with the largest boy band in the world. And interesting in terms of our relationship to this, in that they became supporters of an art project that we launched at the beginning of the year. Victoria.
So kind of looking also at the way that cultural policy at a national level kind of relates to technology, but also the art field. It's interesting to look at Singapore, where there's a very tight feedback between policy at all levels and culture. So for example, this is an exhibition that looked at the history of playgrounds in Singapore over the course of half a century. But what was really interesting about that exhibition is that it was also an invitation to the general public to feed into policy on the use of urban space within Singapore. It was also kind of used as a, let's say, data mining site for understanding how the population of the Singapore would like kind of the urban space to be developed. Probably like there's like a very big kind of PR dimension to this and sort of lip service to like inclusive governance. But I guess what's really interesting is that there are various models that are emerging where kind of the cultural sector, technology, and governance are in very close conversation with each other. So moving on, for example, Tencent, as many of you will know, it's kind of it's the owner of China's answer to WhatsApp, so the owner of WeChat, but they also have one of the largest kind of gaming businesses in China and I think globally. But in 2018, they launched this initiative called Tech for Good, which really places a big emphasis on the role that tech plays in providing social infrastructure. So whereas, let's say, in the kind of Euro-American models, there's certain antagonism that is built in between the relationship of, let's say, social needs and social evolution on an infrastructural level and tech private interests. In the case of China, like there's basically let's say, a framing that kind of shows that the future of technology is also the future of social infrastructure. And so instead of kind of posing antagonism, there's this synergy or a type of acknowledgement that these things are kind of one and the same within the current state of affairs. But as we kind of heard from one of our researchers, Miyu, she's been sort of pointing to the fact that this kind of Tech for Good initiative is also a way for art to be channeled into these initiatives and to kind of start shaping what it means to say tech for good at this large scale, which is not something that's explicitly present in the context of kind of Euro-American tech organizations. This kind of brings us to the larger question of like, what is the role of tech infrastructure in today's geopolitics? And I think someone like Benjamin Braden has made a really interesting argument in the recent years, where he kind of compares the big tech platforms to new proto-sovereigns, and kind of states that ultimately, if we look at the way that these giants are organized, they very much resemble new geopolitical projects. And so with this kind of transformation in the way that technology is sort of shaping social development and politics, what is maybe interesting to think about is that politics itself might look much more like technological development today. So the narrative formation that we usually attributed to politics really needs to happen around technology in a very kind of direct way, whereas the kind of political, what we have, whereas the kind of technological dimension, things that we use as tools and how tools are distributed and put to use, is something that needs to be made more clear on the economic level. So I think with what Ben has just sort of shown in terms of the different shifts that have been happening in the tech's approach to the cultural sector, what we really see emerging is the tech field within the Euro-American context no longer really just being a corporation that's supporting initiatives within the cultural and art field, but really kind of developing its own footprint as an organizer of culture. And that will definitely have and is having a lot of kind of important consequences, repercussion for the traditional cultural field. At the same time, if we look sort of at different experiments in other areas of the planet, of the world, we see that there are different models emerging for how the relationship between culture, technology, and governance is being structured.
So just to take it back a little bit in terms of where I guess I started some of the work at Serpentine, I think the one thing that's important to signal to is the fact that, you know, the attempt on the part of arts institutions and museums to kind of do the process of digital transformation or to benefit from various forms of digital innovation over the last 20 or 30 years has not been like a total failure, but there's a certain aspect of the kind of organizational approach to onboarding these processes into the organization that just hasn't really worked out. And the kind of shorthand of that is to say that for the most part, that process has been producing or creating digital departments inside an arts organization. And we've seen a number of these fail, particularly like high profile ones. And it was, you know, having had the experience of working within the curatorial department, one of my observations was that the reason for that is that the kind of curatorial voice leads in terms of how, you know, content and art and etc. is developed. And a lot of the ideas that come in through the kind of digital are somewhat disruptive to that. And there hadn't necessarily been a synergy around that. And not to say that that tension doesn't continue to exist, and it cannot be like really smoothed out, because for the most part, much of the art that we see produced in galleries is produced on the basis of a kind of artistic discourse, and is not measured against metrics, etc., up against kind of audience development strategies and requirements by funders like ACE, etc., on kind of matching a particular success criteria. So the approach that we took was kind of creating this CTO position that sat at a kind of more senior and slightly more bureaucratic position within the organization, but played a holistic role. So the idea was never to like develop a department, but rather to do kind of mission orientated kind of processes of transformation, and kind of time limited projects. And the reason why I show this slide, and I'm going to show a number of slides quite quickly from internal slide decks that were used as a way to explain why there was a necessity for this. So this is code from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, not because I think it's a good model of self-actualization, but rather because it's something that many people are familiar with, and it explains an idea quite clearly and quite quickly. And so when I started out, this would always appear at the kind of top of the agenda with the directors of the institution, because the aspiration is so much orientated towards the initiatives that appear in public, and the ability for an arts institution to be able to do technologically driven projects at the same level as you might expect them to present a painting show, when that painting show has been part of the kind of strings of the bow of the institution for 50, 100 plus years. The ability to then turn that same lens on artistic projects using technology is difficult. So you have public technology initiatives at the top, and then the notion that we need to develop a research and development and a network around the organization, the underlying systems that shape the organization. So I just went through a 4-year process of overhauling all of the systems of the institution, implementing quite different systems to what you usually see in an arts institution, and integrating all of the kind of data strategy around that, and fundamentally like the staff. So rather than building a team, embedding different skill sets within different departments, so there's a general fluency across the organization. And in order to like coherently explain some of the ideas around how the intersection of technology with a kind of institutional mode will change that institution, I developed a lot of different kind of like graphs and thinking models, etc. And this one was the most successful. So it's a 2x2 that explains, you have different types of projects, and it's best summarized in this example where we do our pavilion, and it's an offline project and it's on site. And then we do the Beijing pavilion, which is offline and it's offsite. But we don't address architecture in these other two areas. And so this was used as a way of explaining why we would need to develop projects in these other fields, not just because we wanted to experiment with those fields, but because within the architectural field, there also hasn't necessarily been an embrace of the kind of disruptive technologies that are emerging now. And I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to play a little bit of this very quickly, and just kind of skip into it. Hopefully you can hear me okay. But what you're seeing here is Jakob Kuhn-Steensen's commission. I'm just going to actually pause it. You can have a look on the website, which is augmentedarchitecture.org. And what we did was we created an open call around a project called Augmented Architecture that asked individuals, not necessarily architects, to rethink the development of kind of spatial logics using augmented reality. And we made that open to anybody. It didn't really matter what background you're coming from. And we partnered with Google and David Adjaye in order to realize this project. We actually ended up getting about 350 applications globally, and there was a process of selection, and we ended up selecting the artist Jakob Kuhn-Steensen, who's a Danish artist that's probably one of the leading artists in the field of using virtual reality as a medium. And we turned Hyde Park and Kensington Gardens into a site where he developed these augmented reality experiences that pick on particular species or fauna around the park. Another example of a project is BOB, which stands for Bag of Beliefs, which was developed by the artist Ian Cheng. And this project, I think, is particularly relevant to the strategy that I'm going to speak through in a second, which is Ian works with simulation engine, gaming engines, builds simulations, and Bob was an attempt to create a artificial life form that has quite a different model around how we think about artificial intelligence. So it has multiple personalities that are competing against each other inside its own being. So it's, in some ways, it's modeled on Jungian archetypes. The reason why this is kind of relevant to thinking through types of projects that can be developed inside an institution is that much of this work was developed off the back of research papers that came out of DeepMind. So it serves as this kind of rapid prototyping exercise for new theories of artificial intelligence. Another project that I touched on briefly was we worked with Hitosh Style. We developed an exhibition, but we also developed an augmented reality app called Actual Reality. And Actual Reality basically would take, I don't have a video of it here, but there's one online. It would take the model of the Serpentine Sackler building and load different data sets into that model that would reshape it in order to demonstrate the context of inequality that's prevalent, particularly in London. So you can see here, seeing this kind of physical manifestation of wealth inequality in the UK. But it's also notable in the context of Hyde Park and Kensington Gardens. Many people think of this borough as being one of the wealthiest, but it's also one of the ones that has the highest level of inequality. Now, I want to say a little bit about, why do we bother to develop these projects, and what's the kind of underlying strategy in relation to technology? So this is a kind of basic theory of how you have technological progression. At any one time, there are a number of discrete technologies that emerge, social media in the form of bulletin boards, online video, mobile apps, and 3G. And it's at the intersection of these technologies that you get the emergence of new things that couldn't necessarily have been anticipated previously. So without this configuration of technologies, you wouldn't get Airbnb, Uber, Facebook, YouTube, etc. A lot of the strategy came into being at a moment about 4 or 5 years ago when certain technologies like virtual reality, augmented reality, robotics, blockchain, AI were starting to work. And so it was very much orientated around this idea that by working with artists and cultivating a community around these things, that we might be able to resituate the institution in closer proximity to new forms of innovation, and kind of through the arts organization bring kind of different communities in proximity to those developments. Now, it's safe to say that in this moment, there are many other technologies that are emerging, and obviously they move at a tremendous speed. So we have the emergence of things like CRISPR-Cas9, cheap aerospace, satellite technologies, quantum computing, etc., and kind of trying to imagine the world that these things are going to produce when they intersect is frankly somewhat unthinkable. And I guess the kind of the background of this that informs these developments is this model called Gardner's hype cycle, where you have expectations running up this axis and time running along the bottom. And it talks about the way in which technologies develop. So you have an innovation trigger, the point at which somebody thinks theoretically and maybe in practice a new technological idea can work. It enters this hype cycle. It inevitably disappoints everybody. And then slowly over time, as you get adoption around this technology, you enter this kind of plateau of productivity. The reason why this is important is because most technologies that are interfaced with by institutions or museums or artists are already at that point of the plateau of productivity. So what it basically means is that all of the work that's being done on them is really just content on top of somebody else's platform. And so I guess what our program is situated around is this question of how can we insert ourselves into that process much earlier on. I'm going to skip over a few of these things because I'm conscious that we've got a lot to get through in this time. I guess I'll just pause on this point before handing over to Victoria is that this is a very kind of crude representation of the history of museums and institutions, but it's obvious that from everything that's been presented in the last like 20 minutes around types of kind of disruptive infrastructural formations and the current and ongoing crises that we're aware of inside our institutions, that we're in a moment of extreme flux, and this diagram is really just like about talking about, you know, the prehistory of the museum being the kind of cabinet of curiosities, moving into a kind of enlightenment project where you're you know, sharing knowledge with the populace, and then the way that merges with the project of the nation state, and as a part of as a kind of ally to globalization, or a tool of the proliferation of museums and institutions globally, very much like comes off the back of those kind of globalizing projects. And we are evidently in a moment where it's not just that we have new highly disruptive technologies that are emerging, but we're also at a point where, you know, the Enlightenment project is maybe coming to an end, it's fracturing, and we're moving to a kind of multipolar world. So inevitably, whether it's the things that we're talking about or not, we are in a moment where we're going to witness a kind of reformation of some type around what we consider a museum or institution to be. Victoria.
Yeah. And so that kind of brings us to this larger question. So if we understand the museum to be not some sort of like a historical form that has existed in a particular organizational, operational configuration, you know, throughout all historical times, but something that has like a very specific, like epochal shape, and also very particular geopolitical shape, that we also understand that, you know, art organizations, I mean, museums is a particular type of organization, so art organizations in general should be subject to organizational change. And I think one way of starting to think about how that change could look like, or how one starts to implement that change, is to really look at the way that kind of the basic model of today's public art organization is put together. And I think the model is very much predicated on a split between there being the core function of the art institution, which is the stage, the front end. So this is the interface for the public. This is where work by contemporary artists, historical artists is shared with the larger audiences. This is where a certain discourse is put into performance effectively for the benefit of larger audiences. At the same time, we understand there's like a back end or backstage dimension to all of these front stage processes. And it's not just the kind of administrative, bureaucratic, and financial processes that kind of make these things, the front end, the realities, the kind of the mechanical stuff, but it's also the kind of relationships and the terms of the relationships that this back end has with other systems of power and government, starting from the organizations like Arts Council England or any other kind of policy or funding within a specific jurisdictional space, you know, ending with various transnational corporations and individuals who are effectively kind of stakeholders within the current configuration of the art institution. So for me, what's really interesting in the work that Ben has done, and where kind of I enter into this narrative, is if we are really thinking about the evolution of an art and technology interface through the kinds of experimental work that Ben's team has been doing, it also kind of means that we need to rethink the foundation, so the type of organization that allows for that work to happen. Because as you had mentioned before, there is a level of specialization to this type of work. So in a way, the curator, you know, who works in these kind of projects, you know, I don't want to sound kind of, it sounds a bit horrible, but in a way, like they're more similar to a product manager in the kind of than they are to a curator who has just art historical training. So the question is, how do we sort of build this new type of organizational foundation for really kind of experimental art and technology projects that on the one hand are able to participate in this kind of early developmental stages of technological narration, so the hype cycle stuff that Ben had just showed, but simultaneously also retain their status as spaces of public accountability and spaces that are accountable to the general public and are actually agents of societal change in a positive way. So if we go to the next slide, Ben. So to this extent, what we had started doing a couple of years ago is just sort of prototyping effectively this organizational dimension that could procure the type of art and technology work that Ben is talking about. And we took the kind of the format of research and development platform as something that's very legible and that is very clear that it's meant to develop the capabilities and the operational processes that would then support new types of practices. And so in the context of the Serpentine, it was clear that with this kind of crazy production schedule to kind of produce more exhibitions, you know, more public-facing content, there wasn't really a space where there could be learnings derived from previous projects and developed into something that looks like infrastructure, rather than sort of, you know, you finish one project, you move to the next one. Like there's a lot of kind of effectively operational waste within that process. But at the same time, in order to take a more preemptive position towards development of new technologies, it was necessary to think what infrastructure is missing right now in the art field. And it became quite evident to us that there's a lot of infrastructure missing within the art field to kind of further procure this type of work. If you move to the second, then. And so we see the kind of the type of organizational design work that we start with the R&D platform is quite specific to the Serpentine, to the positioning of the Serpentine, and also to the role that it wanted to play in relationship to this new chapter, new era of art and tech projects. But at the same time, on, let's say, a more kind of structural level, this sort of non-public facing reflexive space where institutions can really think about what they are, how they're serving their mission, whether their processes are really allowing them to serve their missions, or in fact, they need to invest into different processes and operational models, that ultimately that kind of space, it wasn't just necessary for the Serpentine. It's actually something that probably every organization requires, and definitely within the cultural sector, where currently there isn't really that much thinking about organizational development in and of itself. So if we move to the final core objective. So in this way, we thought by prototyping the Serpentine OD platform, but simultaneously connecting to other, let's say, peer projects, both within the UK, and these exist, but also internationally, and kind of trying to develop a language and maybe a set of templates as to how this work could be done. What we'll be doing is we'll be contributing to a sort of rough outline of an architecture for future art ecosystems that would be supporting art and technology projects. And just to give you a very quick kind of overview of what this has meant just in practice, like how we're doing it. Effectively, we have a couple of labs that are focused on very specific types of infrastructure. So for example, we have a creative AI lab, which is really just focused on the use of creative AI interfaces in the context of these projects. We have a legal lab, which is focused on the kind of legal infrastructure or the construction of legal infrastructure in order to make these types of projects sort of, more, because effectively a lot of legal issues that arise given the complexity of an artwork like Jakob Kurt-Stenson's The Deep Listener, which Ben had showed. And we can go into detail, we can explain those maybe if there is a question around that. We also have a blockchain lab, which is really kind of a continuation of the work that Ben and Ruth Catflow from Furtherfield had started doing around blockchain technologies in the art field, and like what kind of mutual symbiosis there could be had in the relationship of these two spheres. As I mentioned, the network aspect is really important for us, insofar as there are a lot of other organizations, arts organizations, that are doing similar work. And I think here there's something about also changing the culture within the art field. You know, everybody likes to claim that they're a pioneer, or that they have like a unique thing that they're doing, rather than sort of really thinking about how identifying something as part of a larger transformation actually gives much more weight and momentum to potential change, right? Than sort of claiming a unique selling point around one's organization. The future art ecosystems with which Suhail has introduced this talk sort of emerges as a way of sharing the learnings from these past years, and also the kind of the start of this R&D platform experiment, but it's also one of a type of published resource that we produce. We also produce various other things that emerge from labs, such as reports, databases, a database for now, and also webinars that kind of give an insight into what infrastructural practice in the art field could look like. So effectively, it's like these are various ways in which we're trying to, or we're hoping to try to, onboard more and more people in the art field to start really thinking about the infrastructural dimension, rather than only about the practice as sort of as a front end operation. And finally, workshops and forums. This is basically just kind of developing new capabilities, and for the art organization inside, so for other colleagues within the art organization, but also kind of sharing this with other organizations across the UK, and trying to kind of upskill around certain roles that need to be upskilled in order to be working with advanced technologies in both kind of a capable way, but also a critical way.
So this is a bit of a teaser for Rival Strategies presentation next week. So we're not actually going to go into any great depth in terms of talking about what Future Art Ecosystems is, and suffice to say that it is a publication that attempts to bring together a kind of a snapshot analysis of this moment in time, and how somewhat unlikely actors from, you know, for a policy level to artist studio level are developing new modes of practice, new business models, etc., which, although are in their infancy at this stage, quite likely kind of will dictate much of the terms on which this infrastructure emerges and is further developed over the next 10 to 20 plus years. And these are just the chapter headings. Victoria, I'm just going to, unless you want to say something specific to this, I'm going to kind of skip over it on the basis that Rival will cover it in depth. Victoria?
No, I think it's all good. Yeah, I think Rival will cover it in depth. I guess maybe the sort of the headline from what we've been saying so far is that this report really focuses on very specific intersection, and it is the kind of art tech intersection, but it also tries to bring to the fore the need for like an infrastructural discourse around the art field. And so basically it's an attempt to start structuring that infrastructural discourse, hence the kind of language and the tone of the publication. But Rival will talk more about that.
And I think maybe just a thing to add here that is the very good point that you raised early on in the kind of conception of this project, Victoria, is that it's worth noting that the kind of strategic analysis around how the art field should develop and evolve, for the most part, over the short period of time, that strategic analysis tends to come from like UBS, investment banking, etc. And in many ways, you can see that that kind of level of strategic thinking has kind of iteratively shaped a much more kind of market-driven art world than we might have necessarily anticipated. So part of this is also thinking about, you know, what can an institution do? Can an institution, from a more kind of artistic perspective, think through alternative strategies and pathways for the development of art. So I think this is the point where there's a kind of sort of break in our talk, and in a way I think that what we wanted to do was present this sort of like, this is our jobs, this is what we do on a daily basis, but it's also a project in itself, and a sort of, I guess, in presenting it in this way, kind of showing it as a sort of case study for thinking through these things. And the reason to present it in that kind of light is because it's very evident to us that the COVID-19 and everything that's happening in 2020 is a sort of event horizon moment where the possibilities and the positions on the chessboard change quite dramatically, and because we're not in the business of dividing the future, it seems necessary to kind of bring this kind of reflective tone. But to summarize what we hope would happen as a result of the development of this trajectory is that we're interested in narrative formation being a kind of core component of the development of new technologies. That technology isn't just the kind of engineering side, but it's the narrative and the community that's constructed around it, and see the art field as being an area that can contribute enormously to that. Through our work, we're very interested in the redefinition of the artist. Principally, that comes from working with, these projects are very complex and they require teams of anywhere between 5 and 20 people. And whilst the artist may play the role of the artistic director, it's like increasingly clear that it's more than the sum of its parts. And so thinking through how the artist role can be redefined in the future as a result of that, this idea of a redefined role as a seat at the table is really, it's just the case that in a lot of the decisions that are being made about the development of new technologies, art isn't present. Like they're just, for the majority, say 99.9% of people in Silicon Valley and those building these vast planetary scale infrastructures just don't give a shit about art. And I think a lot of what we've been trying to develop is not to kind of acquiesce to that agenda, but to attempt to build a bridge where your position could be taken seriously, without you kind of neutering it on the way. And what's the fourth? Do you want to say something on this last point, Victoria?
Sure. I mean, I guess also just to quickly return to the redefinition of artist, maybe there's also something about the fact that the current model of the artist is really it's coupled quite closely to the art market, even if that artist is not really performing well in the art market. But there's somehow like an understanding of the economic foundation of being an artist that sort of the art market is the main space that is meant to provide some sort of economic sustainability. And of course, in the end, that's not what happens. And usually, artists have other jobs such as teaching, or they try to subsist in various grants in a piecemeal fashion. But effectively, like that kind of model is not really working. So I think another reason of thinking about like redefining artists, but from an organizational perspective, is really in order to kind of provide an economically sustainable model for developing a practice within really the realities of the world. That might mean moving away from this kind of modernist solo genius paradigm of the artist and from some of the kind of key things that we associate with artistic expression. But I think these are really interesting, kind of challenging questions that are really relevant to the current moment. In terms of the deeper awareness, the tangible impacts and capabilities of the art field, I mean, this is just to say that, art institutions, they are de facto performing a lot of important functions within urban development. They're kind of a great attractor for various urban regeneration projects. They have been clearly within the neoliberal era, really important sites for transforming, let's say, financial capital into cultural capital. There are also weirdly some kind of shadow scenes of various political processes. If we look at, the people who are on boards of various organizations, the way that various boards are constructed, there's a clear dimension of a shadow political project within the current contemporary art setup. But of course, we don't really talk about it. There's a certain, either, there's a rejection of that reality as being inherently wrong, or just generally people we pretend like it doesn't exist. And I think what this more organizational infrastructural approach allows is to be a bit more kind of upfront about what capabilities exist within the art field, and maybe to start dissecting a bit better as to what are the things that can be developed and evolved in order to produce the impacts that we want, and what are the things that can be left behind and that we don't really need to participate in. So then moving to the next slide. So yeah, and I guess this one is meant to be just sort of, and then there is kind of a schism, right? Or like a moment of massive disorientation that happens as a result of the measures that have been implemented. Of course, this talk is a direct consequence of these measures, and we all know what these measures are. We also all know what the kind of economic consequences, even if, let's say, the criteria according to these economic consequences are assessed, are themselves subject to question. Everybody questions what is GDP, etc. But it's clear that the future of the art field in its established formation is very much hostage to this economic reality. Similarly, in terms of furloughed jobs, as many of you may know, like within the art institutional complex, most people have been put in furlough because the key function of the art organization, which is the public program, the public aspect, cannot be fulfilled. And here we've got sort of second prize for being the second worst hit sector in the UK, after obviously everything has to do with tourism. And once again, similar statistic, just showing how effectively the business model of the art institution that is currently predicated on all of the front end, on all the kind of public components and public presentation of itself, just cannot really be maintained within the COVID reality. Ben, do you want to take on with the cultural wasteland?
I think we'll just skip over the cultural wasteland. I mean, the headline says it itself. But I think that one of the things that we also wanted to add, that there's a number of other things that are sort of going on. Well, some of them are in the foreground, some of them are in the background. This is, Amazon stock. Amazon has come out and said that it will be like the first vaccinated global supply chain. Tech is something that's done, particularly well. There's this very kind of insightful talk on DLD's platform that was given maybe a month ago by somebody at NYU called Scott Galloway. And so I've just pulled out a number of points that he made in this talk. This one being the example that, at this point, the kind of FANGs represent an enormous percentage of the entire London FTSE 100. But also, if you're tracking what's happening with some of these companies, Amazon's made 175,000 recruitments, whilst almost everybody else has been in the process of layoffs. And I think that perhaps the most kind of salient and interesting point that came from this presentation for me was this kind of basic observation around kind of projected growth for major tech companies and what they need to do in order to achieve that growth. And essentially what they have to do is they have to consume in entirely, whole ecosystems. And Scott Galloway in this talk speculates that the next two industries that tech will take over and will very much use the kind of pandemic crisis as an opportunity for accumulation will be education and healthcare. And you're likely to see this play out in terms of kind of partnerships between kind of high Ivy League brands and tech companies, and the inevitable hollowing out of those industries. So obviously it raises some questions about, does tech care enough to move in and begin a kind of process of acquisition for the cultural field, or is that something that's going to be entirely ignored? But there's obviously an opportunity there for it. I think it's highly questionable whether it needs to it needs to do the acquisition, or whether it can build out an entirely different offer. I think that it's also worth kind of pointing to some other weird stuff that's happening. So it was in the last month or so, this was in April, that SpaceX, Blue Origin, and Dynetics were handed large contracts by NASA for doing manned missions to the moon. The US unveiled the Space Force in the White House. And simultaneous to this, you've also had Trump kind of tearing up the only international treaty that exists for the governance of space. This as an area to pay attention to, I think, is worthwhile. And then more recently, just last week, you have this kind of the Amazon exec becoming the head of the Natural History Museum. I think there are lots of questions as to why this would happen. But one thing that I would point out in relation to natural history museums, there is as a kind of agenda right now where, as biotechnology advances, it's obvious that these can become kind of storehouses. So there's essentially become databases for biological information. And so there's a perhaps more cynical eye that one can put on these kinds of movements. But what am I supposed to do now? I guess this is the point where we're kind of going to end the talk. And I think one of the things that's worth saying is that me and Victoria planned this talk a couple of times over the course of the last 2 months. And I think initially we had an idea of kind of presenting some of these pathways as like the route forward. I think that we have more questions than we do any kind of answers right now. But I think that what we've tried to illustrate is that we are in this moment of, real seismic shifts on a cultural level, or a social justice level, on kind of all spheres. And it's also evident that these things are not going to they're not going to let up. I think the thing that's important to point to here is that in these moments, it tends to be the case that people that have kind of got pre-existing plans or models for transformation kind of on the shelf, those are the things that are taken off in the moment of a crisis in order to attempt to kind of solve and kind of patch over some of these issues. And to that extent, that it's kind of crucial that I think more broadly, those that care about the art field take steps to kind of rethink what it can be. Victoria, I don't know what you might want to add to that.
Yeah, maybe just a very basic point around kind of discontinuities, but also continuities. So, of course, we kind of see the pandemic period as an abrupt transformation to business as usual, at least in terms of like daily experience of life. But I think the two trajectories that we have kind of outlined, one is sort of the slow and now accelerated death of the public art institution, like within the sort of modernist model. And the other, which is like the accelerated rise to power at all levels of governance of the tech sector. Like, I think these trends have been strengthened effectively. And so the question is, for actors who are within the dying art field, so to speak, right? Like, what is it that is, like, what is an important project for the next 50 years, right? If there is investment into art, so, and a commitment to art. And it really seems to us that the infrastructural project, or the organizational project, however one may call it, is a really key dimension of that, because it's kind of the very foundations of from where we work with that are being really kind of torn out from under our feet. So the questions that we kind of pose for ourselves, but which can also be maybe jumping points of discussion, kind of point in that direction.
Should I just read them out?
Please.
Okay, so this was a list of questions we almost like threw together out of the kinds of conversations that we've been having over the last couple of months, where are the points of leverage from which change can now be made if the internal field is collapsing? And that's kind of speaking to the financial situation as a kind of bottom line. In the context of abolition, does a reformist agenda even make sense? So this very much like comes from a moment of personal reflection. It's clear that an abolitionist agenda is very important. How it relates to the art field is crucial, but it obviously puts into question the fact that we ourselves have adopted a reformist strategy over the course of the last however long, and whether that's effective going forward. Will the cultural agendas articulated by big tech now just be rooted around cultural sector, and or will they be a move to acquisition? So I kind of already highlighted this as a potential way that things are going to play out. And then just two more questions. Can art's method be exported to other fields rather than the arbitration of other fields into art? I guess like a good kind of equivalent for this is if you look at the kind of project of design thinking, and the way that that was orchestrated and seeded as a kind of psyop, but did lead to design being taken seriously inside many, many different organizations. And we're still just at the kind of infancy of that development. And then the obvious question, and I think kind of working from the perspective of, infrastructure and seeing the things that you need to change inside an institution in order for it to embody the things that it speaks about. I think that it's kind of critical to ask the question of, will the current focus on structural and systemic issues within cultural institutions lead to a systemic change, or will it be something that's kind of will we have some like quick solutions? Obviously there's the creation of a lot of task forces right now, et cetera, et cetera. And this is not an issue that anyone is not acutely aware of right now. Both Serpentine and Goldsmiths obviously find themselves confronting these questions. So that's it.
Wow, thank you. All right, I'm wait for my video to start off. Thank you for that. That's a huge amount of work. So thank you for the work you put into it, and also a lot of information and ideas for us to contend with. I'm going to just ask an initial question where people kind of put together their own, and it's basically to do with kind of critical legacies in a way. So maybe you kind of touched upon it. Victoria mentioned towards the end about the kind of two models of like the decline of the modernist art institution, which is also a certain figure of the artist as individuated soul maker who has ideas and then kind of somehow seeds them out into always benighted institution compared to the brilliance of their ideas. So that model seems was anyway highly questionable because of the work through post-structuralism, postmodernism, but it's also now become institutionally difficult because of the, I think you mentioned, Ben, through the talk, the business modeling of the art field over the last 15, 20 years by investment corporations and banks has kind of marketized the art field. And they very much rely upon that modernist figure as well as a kind of, that's the UPS of each art product. But that itself indicates that we're not really in modernism anymore. We've kind of moved, or even postmodernism. We've kind of, the art field is already doing something else than what from the art space we think it's doing. And then the other model was to kind of don't really use the word accelerate anymore, to intensify the engagements with the kind of tech pickup of art, and also the way that tech is now, especially digitech, is now going to be like the leading capital capitalism as well, not just of the products that we use, right? I mean, in terms of market capitalization through the graphs that you showed, oil is on the way out, kind of heavy industry is geared up towards producing tech and its aftermath, and so So that's the place that the not just the business sector but the cultural sector is going to start associating with. In that 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 screenshot from the Guardian about Natural History Museum and the guy from Amazon seems like prescient in terms of that development. Kind of captures it very well. But just to kind of frame it, I think your talk fits very well in the three that we've had. So in the first week we had Maria Lavayova speaking very much about how the institution she runs carries through a lot of the commitments from post-structural discourse, and important commitments: anti-racism, feminism, queer, kind of new materialist set of commitments, kind of broad anti-fascist sensibility, and the challenges to that, given the kind of developments you're talking about, but also what happens with COVID and the kind of restructuring of the social space, which that type of discourse attaches itself to and finds its meaning in. Last week, Prem was giving a very kind of description of a very kind of spontaneous and pragmatic set of responses to the various circumstances he's found himself in terms of making new communities, and how the art field helps him do that. And today you've given a kind of very broad, systemic, kind of infrastructural overview of the conditions the art field is going to find itself in. It's already finding itself in, but it's going to become much more, much clearer and more powerful in the coming years. And COVID, as you said, is the kind of fire starter to kind of make that happen. But I guess what I'm interested in, that sort of combination, and I think those three things kind of represent a pretty good overview of the art field, right? So you've got the kind of business model is changing, which seemed to me what you were describing, and also the institutional model is changing as well, and you were describing that very well. You've got the kind of critical commitments, which our side of the art field is kind of still invested in, and I think Maria was talking about the quandaries and problems of maintaining that. And then you've got the kind of what do practitioners do, kind of caught between these two things, and given the kind of limitations that COVID and lockdown has presented us. So I think within that broad framework and kind of keeping the whole picture in mind, what you present, what you and Victoria present, sounds right, but also what happens to the suspicion around big tech and big corporations? Because in a way, what you suggest is that we need to kind of both modify. I think you said at one point, Ben, you said that in the art space we've kind of been subject to external shapings of what the art world should be, which is the kind of business model. And actually, art institutions, art organizations, and art people invested in art haven't really been at the table to kind of shape and turn those demands to other more productive ends. So there's a sense in which we need to engage with the kind of tech takeover. But on the other hand, we also know we need to be extremely skeptical about what tech does. So, at the moment, what we see, and it's kind of clearer in China in a way, but there's lots of worries about it in terms of data tracking here. There's a huge kind of surveillance operation underway in China. There's Zuboff's work upon about the age of surveillance capitalism. Tech is it's fundamental to these changes in control, which are exactly the things that we're supposed to be critical about from the kind of post-structural traditions and modernist traditions. So there's a kind of way in which your pragmatic approach says, well, it's going this way, we should just kind of go with it and sort of see if we can do something with it. But that, what happens to the skepticism around tech in that, I guess? I'm asking, just before you come in, I'm asking this, I guess, because I want to go, I think one response to this would be, well, no, this is completely unavailable to us because, of course, the corporation, the capitalist corporation and big tech have to be the enemies. They have to be the enemies for the kind of residual, the residual critical claims that we continue to maintain. And your model seems to say, maybe not. So I'm just wondering.
Should I go first on that? Yeah. Okay. So So I guess there's a couple of different things. One is, you know, in terms of my personal experience, like I came into, you know, I've kind of always been around the art field, but for the most part, like growing up as a teenager and what I was doing professionally to support myself, I was involved in, you know, kind of hacker communities, open source, free software movement, all of that kind of stuff. And so coming into the art field, you know, and it being dominated by particular forms of kind of elitism, as etc. I guess like on a there are kind of pockets of criticality, but there's also this level of like continual internal contradiction, which is somewhat like less present within the technology field because well, actually, it's also kind of similar. But I guess the simple thing I'm saying there is just like in terms of personal experience, it's like when we so often the kind of critique of like we shouldn't take money from corporations, etc. I guess my kind of impulsive response is always, well, should we then just continue to take money from the aristocratic class that's continued to fund this over the course of the last like couple of centuries? So, I mean, that's the kind of base, kind of trite oppositional way that I often think about that. But I think that what's of more critical importance is right now that there's enormous things at stake. So like in a very short time horizon, a lot of really significant decisions are going to be made about how artificial intelligence functions within society, how kind of rules in software butt up against kind of regulatory systems and human rights and all of that kind of stuff. And so if you're not somehow embedded within the process, there's no hope of changing it. And so that's, again, the kind of reformist agenda. And then what was my most important point? I guess I should be candid and say that when I started working at the Serpentine, I refused to work with technology corporations. And I was, you know, it was recognized that was a position that I could hold, and I was supported in it, which was great. And it was actually my choice as an individual to change that position. It wasn't the pressuring of the institution in any way. And really, that comes from kind of geopolitical shifts where if you want to break up technology companies right now, a lot of that is coming from the kind of rise of authoritarian regimes, and the antitrust movement is definitely like in the US is a Trumpian effort. And so I guess that we find ourselves in an interesting situation when these technology companies are starting to take on their own form of sovereignty, and the kind of threat of breaking them up is more illiberal than their own. I would invite being challenged on that. But and then the last thing I would say is that there are technology companies that I absolutely wouldn't work with, that I think are rotten to the core. And that's not just the ones that work in the military industrial complex. But I also think when you do work with these companies, you learn a lot about them. And when you work with Google, you definitely learn that Google is not a monolith. And actually, it's more like a strange tribal feudal system, where there are lots of different competing groups and ideologies inside of this like larger structure. And that can really be observed from the fact that probably 30% of what Google produce, they produce for their own internal kind of staff. So it's like a couple of points that's very much like come from starting out in that position of critique.
Victoria, do you want to?
I mean, I guess maybe another way of answering this question would be to just also ask where this sentiment is coming from, right? In terms of like having this very kind of binary approach to what is possible if one, quote unquote, collaborates with external fields that are embedded in dubious political and ideological projects. And I think one place it comes from is lack of recognition that contemporary art itself comes from a very dubious geopolitical project, right? You know, if we understand contemporary art really as the global paradigm of it, as a product of like the most recent wave of globalization, financialization, you know, we could argue that in many ways, and let's say the kind of philosophical assumptions that drive this project are kind of equally horrible as those that drive, you know, the project of massive surveillance and of complete like lack of human rights and use of technology as a way of ensuring authoritarian control, right? So I think my approach is like, you know, if we're going to go into the sort of deeper foundations of what's good and bad, we need to be sure that we're actually on a solid foundations ourselves in terms of like the kind of the ethical accountability that we think we hold. So to this extent, you know, I prefer to shift away from this binary approach and to really be quite specific about what intervention are we making, from where are we making this intervention, have quite a sober analysis as to what is this organizational space that is the Serpentine, what is the context within which we work with these different companies or are potentially producing infrastructure that will be used by all of these interests. So in many ways, maybe what I'm trying to argue for is a certain specialization which needs to develop within the art field in order for us to move away from these like really massive kind of brushstroke assumptions about the way the world works, but somehow we ourselves are always not, we're always on the right side, right? And start kind of thinking more in greater detail and kind of in greater, with greater resolution on the specific sites that we inhabit, the kind of agency that we have in specific collaboration situations, and what these settings are producing on the other end. So, so to this extent, you know, a project, let's say, that has to do with like, let's say, financializing the art field, you know, could look very differently depending on who you partner up with, what your basic assumptions are as to what finance is meant to do. And I'm using kind of the example of finance because it's, you know, it's very clear that the art is financialized today. So that's like another actor with whom the art field has jumped into bed. But ultimately, the way that value is distributed, it doesn't really benefit most of the art field. It only benefits, you know, 1% of the art field. So but it's clear that financial models could be helpful for redistributing value on a more grassroots level, yet that hasn't really happened. So I think the problem of like taking this very kind of large brushstroke approaches is that it narrows the pathways that are available in any specific situation. And the situation that we described with Ben at the Serpentine, it's like it's a very particular configuration. And I don't think that configuration can be mapped onto, let's say, a similar situation in China, because we'd be talking about something completely different. So yeah, so I guess it's just an argument for specificity and just greater acute awareness of what is available right in front of us.
Okay, I think I could engage with this for quite a while, but I think there's a few more questions.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I don't know, I can put video. So, yeah, I had a question to Ben, or just, I don't know, and you mentioned like working with companies and somehow like being involved in this process of like where technology goes, which yeah, as we see, there's like different directions. And I wonder like if you maybe have like practical examples of like how that could work, or if you worked like this with artists, for example, like yeah, because it seems so yeah, I'll be just curious.
Yeah, I think the best practical example I can give is not necessarily. I mean, I always use Ian Cheng's Bob as like a good example, but it's kind of in the reverse. So it's like it's not. It's like his work is built on top of someone else's research paper. So it's more that it's in dialogue and like demonstrating that certain things are possible in a very quick development cycle. But probably the best example of this type of work is Kenrick McDowell's work as part of AI research at Google. And just in terms of anecdotal experience, definitely like a sort of reality check moment for me about two and a half years ago was at a kind of Google and Arts hosted conference on artificial intelligence. And the head of AI research at Google was giving this presentation, and they started off with a Deleuze and Guattari quote, and then went on to talk about Beatrice Preciado's Testo Junkie and like the nature of gender and how that relates to the kind of vectorization of like data in machine learning models, etc. And that, I mean, that was a real kind of like what the fuck moment, because there were obviously like a lot of artists present at that conference that thought they were going to sort of school Google, and it was like kind of the opposite, and that was like the opening gambit. But what's interesting specific to that program is that
a school is an educational institution designed to provide learning space.
Sorry, that was my Google Assistant going off. That's totally throwing me off. But the example I was going to give was that department within research there hosted a series of workshops with people like Timothy Morton, Hito Steil, Benjamin Bratton, etc., on the ontology of a user. So basically asking this question of currently the way that a user is perceived is through like a credit card number, an email address, etc. So from a machine vision perspective, it sees us humans as those data points. And so they hosted this workshop with these artists and philosophers in order to kind of disentangle that question. And out of that has come, which is not public, it's not public or published at the moment, but out of that has come like quite a crucial defining element in how they've constructed the kind of user ontology in some of their AI research. And I think that I mean, if that's successful and it also leads to a situation in which I don't want to go as far as to say like a more equitable model of AI, because I think that's a very difficult thing to be certain about. But if it does produce a kind of product innovation, it's also a sort of gateway into this thing happening. But definitely the examples of this actually working are far and few between, because there are so few people working on it.
Victoria, maybe do you want to speak, just to extend Aaron's question, do you want to speak a bit maybe about institutions or organizations that have done the kind of work that you're advocating?
I mean, sorry, but can we be a bit more specific about the question?
Aaron was just asking for examples of the case that you're making, because in a way it's also it's a kind of speculative case about, you know, if we make these moves, but it's based on certain historical models which have been somewhat successful but also not successful. So just in terms of how organizations have interfaced with or worked with either corporations or larger firms or sectors outside of the art field in ways that interest you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe just sort of a slightly more historical response to this question is that obviously there is like a long legacy of art and technology projects, you know, from like, definitely from the US, but also the kind of various European versions and even a British version, although it wasn't tech specific, but it was about placing artists into tech industry settings, the artist place, probably most of you know about it. So in a sense, there is this kind of history, there is a very rich history, right, to art fields kind of trying to send in visionary artists into the tech developmental process in order to shape it. Most of these experiments have not been very successful. In part, it is a question of scale. In part, if you read, for example, some of the accounts from the Xerox PARC project, you kind of realize how the way that they were organized, you know, they were very short term. The way that these groups of people put together were kind of very awkward. So it was very much about the possibility of a relationship emerging, the chances of which were quite slim. So you kind of understand that there is a legacy. There's also clear like a failed legacy in some ways. What there is less emphasis on is a creation of a hybrid field. And when I talk about a hybrid field, it's rather than maybe kind of going off from what I was saying before, rather than seeing the art field as a distinct space that promotes certain values and the tech field as a distinct space that is representative of these other ideological processes, like we kind of heighten the resolution and we'll look at the spaces within the art field and within the tech field that can kind of come together, or communities that come together to start sort of prototyping this potential new spaces. I think the example that that has given in terms of Henrik McDowell and the artists and AMI is a very good example of like a potential node within a larger ecosystem of organizations. Ours could be an example, let's say, or specifically, let's say the arts, technologies, and the R&D side of the Serpentine, rather than maybe everything within the Serpentine. Then we, you know, just maybe also kind of naming other people we're in conversation with. There is an artist collective that it has like a long-term residency at a biotech company in Denmark called Diacon. So they're also quite interesting in terms of, instead of kind of having this very narrow window, temporal window residency model for which the art world is famous, they kind of made this very long-term and, you know, quite a heavy commitment to try and figure out a relationship with this company that would hopefully result in a like hybrid type of organization. So what are the examples? Ben, can you help me in terms of like very concrete examples where this kind of hybridity, even if it's at quite granular scale and maybe doesn't have at present, you know, the kind of capacity to challenge the sort of the master narratives, but where it's still emerging, it could be some kind of sketch for an ecosystem to come?
I mean, I think the really sketchy ones are, there's this kind of art crypto space, which is sort of affiliated with the work that I do with Ruth Catlow. So there's a project called Black Swan DAO, which is attempting to use like blockchain technologies as decentralized autonomous organizations in order to create like a different set of utility for how artists can organize together, but not just artists, that kind of like broader definition. And that's like located in Trust in Berlin, which is like a good example. I mean, a lot of those people are kind of emerging from the Strelka New Normal course, which in a way is a sort of like incubator for this particular like alternative people coming with real tech skills and real knowledge of building those systems, but also a good understanding of art history. And that kind of configuration is quite rare, but obviously in its infancy. I didn't want the only example I gave to be like something that happened inside Google. So another person that's good at representing the long history of this type of work, but it being heavily under-recognized, is an artist based in LA called Rebecca Allen, who was the first person to put a human 3D model into a computer. She introduced Kraftwerk to like 3D modeling, but she also developed kind of like the first Google Glass, And there's actually quite an interesting prosaic image of her like demonstrating it to Sergey Brin from Google, and then they obviously go and produce this as a product a decade later. She also worked with a group of other artists to develop basically Google Street View before we have it today. She's quite exceptional in that sense, and the way that she was able to do that was essentially the art field at the time in which she was working was 110% disinterested in technology. So the only way that she was able to like build her projects was to kind of bid for the creation of labs within industry.
Okay, mine's a little bit of a lengthy comment slash question. So yes, thank you for expanding on your project, Ben and Victoria. And Suhail, I understand the questioning around the perceived, if you can't beat them, join them approach when it comes to incorporating technology. But there's something to be said maybe for making use of, a controversial modality in order to subvert its course and perhaps regain some form of power that had been previously compromised, by that imbalance initiated by the thing itself, possibly even adapting it along the way. So geopolitically, as a person of Lebanese heritage, I've understood the necessity of, that kind of adaptation in order to not only survive, but to progress in new settings necessitated by contemporary crises. However, there's an aspect of aloneness as a side effect or, isolation, and the ability to incorporate tech into my practice has been very key in progression and alleviation of this experience. But sadly, despite these increased opportunities that tech and advances in tech can provide, I wonder if we still have old gatekeeping structures in place, one that enables a sort of vicious cycle of artists operating on a sort of periphery, despite them, exploring similar or tangential themes to what your project is also exploring. So you've spoken quite a bit about outreach to other art organizations in order to develop that sort of ecosystem of art and technologies with that geopolitical angle. Given that such pre-existing organizations perhaps are built on a typical, exclusionary or market-driven approach, is there any consideration around independent artists who are perhaps also on a technologically driven and data-driven path that could also provide valuable input into this endeavor?
And Enda, if you want to go now.
Yeah, sure. I think my question is very similar. I was just thinking about it in relation to infrastructure, because I feel like often when, with a few really good examples notwithstanding, quite often when artists embrace technology in their work or embrace the cutting edge of technical research in their work, quite often what they're doing is kind of confirming that cutting edge a fortiori rather than, recombining some of the basic elements to produce something new. Even when collaboration happens, and I totally agree with the claim that, we need to move away from, or we need to further undermine the myth of the individual genius, and move to a collective mode of working. But even where we see these collective modes of working, often it seems like a kind of imperfect translation between different kind of actors who can't fully understand each other, or can't move beyond this point of like not being able to understand each other and trying nonetheless. I guess like my question is just like, is it worthwhile to think about an infrastructure of education in addition to like an infrastructure for art to be shown and exist within the art world, and specifically a kind of education which would mean that artists became more skilled in the kind of practices that relate more directly to the kind of technical processes that we're talking about as having a determining impact on the future. Maybe that is what you're also kind of suggesting, and I missed it, but I was just thinking about this, like, especially in relation to the hype curve that we were shown, in which the role of the artist is to kind of be this instigating agent at the very beginning of that. But I think quite often artists aren't really doing that. And quite often we get like people who have lots of technical skills and expertise saying this is a misunderstanding of the basic principle, and it's been turned into like an aesthetic fetish object of some kind. So I don't know, like this is kind of maybe not a super clear question, but I'm just interested if you had any thoughts on it in general.
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of things that I would say in terms of, I think one thing that needs to be considered in relation to the contemporary art field is like, it's actually kind of small, right? So in terms of like the growth of deviant art and like entirely different spheres, Kickstarter being like an interesting example of where like DIY communities can grow, but also the indie game scene, et cetera, et cetera. And in terms of that exclusionary model of like what, you know, what does and does not constitute like a contemporary art object, that I think that is one of like the principal problems for the that cuts across all of these lines in terms of race, class, experience, education, all of these things, because there are so many things that the museum, institutional, art world, industrial complex has just decided don't qualify as a kind of high culture. So in terms of individuals playing a role in shaping that type of innovation, I guess that one thing I would say is that I think there are opportunities that are not quite so grating and such an uphill struggle outside of the kind of common art world as we understand it today. That's not to say, you know, beyond the gates of like the art world, there is these incredible meritocracies by any means, but I personally consider video games as to be as a field of art, and the types of innovation that have been developed in the space of maybe I guess it's about 15-20 years, from like people taking certain video games to pieces, remodeling them, and then relaunching them, and that really being one of the genesis points for the creation and distribution of video game engines. And now video game engines are entering this point which they would sit well on the slide alongside quantum computing in terms of they will be used to develop many different industries, fields, etc. That I do see as like as an alternative pathway, and I guess like part of my suspicion about like what will happen as a result of the gatekeeping that continues to happen inside the kind of core infrastructure of the art world is that the art world will, as I think many of us are kind of discussing it under the rubric of contemporary art, will shrink and resemble something more similar to like the 1960s. And there will be these other fields that don't have necessarily the same hang-ups and perhaps have like a different questions around aesthetics and how community is constructed. I don't want that to just be my answer and then we go to the next one. So it would be good. Does that fill in some of the gaps of what you were asking?
Hi, Ben. So yes, it does. I think that's a really interesting and unexpected point that you just made about the art sphere kind of redacting and being more closely knit than it is currently as a potential side effect. But I just, I guess my question wasn't necessarily around increasing or widening the idea of what art could be, but more so perhaps more marginalized artists who are not already existing within the market-driven institutional sphere.
Yeah, so I guess to clarify, like specifically how I was in terms of how I was answering it, is that I guess what I'm saying is that the next 12 months will determine a lot in terms of how willing the kind of the institutional gatekeepers are to go through a process of like transformation and change. But if I was an artist now standing on the other side of the institute, on the other side of that like divide between artist and institution, my strategy of offense would be to make the institutions more relevant than they already are.
Okay.
Okay, Victoria, do you want to respond to Ender's question as well about?
Yeah, maybe I'll move on just for the sake of time as well. I'll move on to the second question around infrastructural education, or maybe the model of kind of art education. I mean, absolutely. We focus particularly on the Serpentine in order to like give certain specificity to this talk. But of course, I think the artists who were part of the projects, Ben has talked about, a lot of them actually don't have an art background, right? They either have kind of a background in design or architecture, or they have previously worked in gaming. So it's interesting that the kind of skill set, the technical skill set is somewhat different to the traditional artist, where still I think kind of discursive erudition is seen as the main asset that an artist should have, obviously on top of like their own vision as to what they want to contribute as an artist, right? But there's a certain kind of solipsism around that. And, even if we look, I've been told by Cyril not to say this, but I will say it anyway. But if we look at the MFA model at Goldsmiths, right, it's also predicated upon a certain image of the art field. But there's a global art field with a global discourse that circulates around globalized institutions. And I think maybe the picture that Ben and I are trying to draw, and definitely I think the picture that is becoming more and more realistic about like post-COVID reality, is that there will be greater and greater fragmentation, and actually there'll be greater like geopolitical fragmentation in terms of how contemporary art, or as in like art of times, intersects with other fields. There will also be niches within the art field itself, depending on what people are kind of specializing in. And that does definitely call for a certain rethinking of what art education is, particularly within the context of this kind of bringing together of people from very different backgrounds, interests, knowledge systems, etc. And on the one hand, and I'm a bit torn on that, because on the one hand, I think there is a lot of merit actually of having this kind of sort of paella of different people, different interests, a slightly ad hoc approach to like designing courses and agendas, etc. I think it creates a certain vibrancy and like responsiveness to the current moment, which really lacks in much more professionalized and narrow disciplines. At the same time, obviously, what we're really missing is this kind of greater specialization that might not necessarily be just technical specialization, but kind of ability to think really strategically about the skill set that you have as an artist that is different to the technical skill set of an engineer, but that is also different to, let's say, the more kind of applied design-oriented skill set exactly of a designer, so or of an architect. So I guess the question is like, can there be kind of a more kind of confederated version of art education, where there are like these opportunities for greater specialization, but then there's also coming together of people from different places and different perspectives, in order not to kind of silo out the way that other fields have siloed out themselves, right, from the rest of reality. So that's a really, really big question. And of course there are, whether it's Black Mountain College or Bauhaus, there have been experiments in this kind of reform, but hopefully both the kind of financial situation and this particular conversation will make this project even more of an urgent kind of need than it has been over the course of the last 20 years.
Okay, there's quite a lot of comments. I'm not following the chat box that closely. How many more questions do we have?
We have Sean next, and then I have to read out a question.
All right, so okay, can we have the next one then?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So due to the bad signal, I wasn't really fully receiving all the conversation. So bear with me if I am a little bit repetitive with the previous conversation. So I admire the historical model of analysis. That's definitely very delicate. But I want to confirm something. Can I understand what you guys are trying to do is to evaluate the incapability of institution in the current context, then to establish a new order with the taste of emerging technology for the new trend in the future art world. And this model of ecosystem can sustain a natural circle of art system with embedded thorough thinking mode of technology / data / science, etc. And however, in terms of the institutional autocracy or its dominant discourses, my question is that since Ben, you've mentioned about the bureaucratic elements and something like the departmental in previous lecture, I wonder if it's so constructive and prevalent in the future, if it's going to be still exclusive or suppressing for many minor possibility of art practices. So what do you consider about that?
Okay, there was a lot in there, so I'm not sure if I caught the question.
So can I and to repeat just the question itself?
I've heard that you've mentioned about the in the early stage of your practice, you have some thoughts about the dominance and the aristocratic phenomenon in the art world, and somehow we can understand this ecosystem can be a solution to that or a way out, but it's still very, how to say, it's embedded with a mode of thinking, a natural mode of thinking with technology, with preference of technology and data and science.
Yeah, I think I know what you're referring to now.
Yeah.
So like the question of like centralization versus decentralization, whether that is still like a worthy project inside the context of the art world. I would be interested. So I'll say what I think on this. I think it would be interesting then, Victoria, if you also kind of spoke about it, because in terms of like when I came into the Serpentine, I talked about this idea of I was obsessed with decentralization as like I guess like a political strategy, and that's because a lot of the work that I was doing was open source movement, early crypto economics, etc. And a kind of deep naivety about what one could achieve in a short space of time. I think the project of decentralization is one that is happening, that is intensifying, but simultaneous to that, so is the project of centralization. So that these two forces are finding themselves in closer and closer conflict. Now, you have like very interesting projects that are emerging right now, like everything that's happening in the Ethereum crypto space, which I think has enormous implications for how infrastructure, organizations, governance, and all of this stuff will function 10 years out from now. But currently, none of the tools work. And as a kind of ideological project, everything that was available in order to try and orchestrate decentralization, I think for the most part sort of fell on its face and didn't stand up. That was certainly my experience of it, in the kind of activist work that I was involved in. So in terms of like whether an institution can play a role in that, I think part of it comes from recognizing the need for a kind of multiplicity of functions. And I think this also speaks to one of the last questions and what Victoria was saying in terms of we're not trying to build the whole thing. and we're definitely not like laying out a master plan. So it's like, yes, there definitely need to be schools that are teaching like a different approach, a different set of skills, are rooted in different networks, different lineages, different histories, all of that. Like there's a lot of stuff to be built right now. But whether that is a system that can function on a model of decentralization, for me personally feels like it's a question that's on hold, because the reality is that this specific project inside of the Serpentine can only function because of the way that it leverages a certain kind of centralized power, capital, and social value. That's not to say I've given up on that work, but I think it is really about this question of being specific and not trying to make all things deliver on, you know, across all agendas. And that was something that for me personally came out of the development of Unmonastery, because it was just, it tried to do too many things based on the principle of decentralization and failed.
Victoria, do you want to take that?
I'm just wondering whether, for the sake of time, we should move on, because that was quite a rich and good answer.
You just say no. It's okay.
So let's move to the next question.
The next question is from Tom, and I'll be reading it out, so hopefully I can do it justice. I'm interested in what of definition of difference art an artist can make in these relationships / collabs / hybrids. There's been talk of effectivity, learning tech process in our organizations, and some visualizations / prototyping of artists, but interested to see how art creates some sort of difference by being art or / done by artists, and what would that, in inverted commas, look like?
All right, so that's kind of how and why is it still art thing. Before Victoria and Ben get to it, was there a question from Rita?
Rita dipped out because I think you covered it yourself.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, I think this is the art specificity question.
I'd say just read the Glass Bead game.
That's a very cryptic answer.
Well, in the Glass Bead game, they never actually describe. They don't actually say what the Glass Bead game is, but it's this kind of coming together of mathematics and music and to form like a different kind of cultural play. I imagine it to be like that in terms of like I think that we're a long way from that. I guess I think that most of this stuff is just in its infancy. So like there's a lot of work that Ian Cheng's doing that like it's kind of there in his simulations, but I think that we won't see the maturity of that work until there are certain technologies that he can work with, because there's actually a limitation within the material. Which is, you know, a common trait to the development of art, that, you know, people are always pushing against materials, and there are certain things. Maybe the two kind of reference points that I would go to is like, what's it look like? Well, I kind of think it feels a bit like Ursula, you know, a lot of Ursula Le Guin's writing in terms of how she defines technology, and its interplay within the entire construction of a world, and maybe like the type of work that will be interesting to see mature is like, if you take like Pierre Huyghe's work in Documenta with the dog with the pink leg and the statue with the beehive on its head, and there's also kind of psychedelic mushrooms that are growing, and they're all kind of they're existing in this kind of like strange interdependent network. It's something about that kind of system of play, but articulated through a set of technologies that I guess they have a degree of I trip over my words if I talked about like autonomy and things like that. But I think that it's something that can only really be gestured towards in that sense. I think to give a concrete answer, what does it look like? Large scale video games that don't play like any video game that you've encountered previously and require a complex team of both like traditional artists and very different skill sets and spheres of knowledge, like forming something that can exist as like one experience in the same way as like a well-constructed exhibition can feel like a single experience and a single thread.
Yeah, I might add to that just maybe on a more kind of meta level, because I think the kind of also demand for art to look like something is also like a very particular historical like understanding of what art is, and like deeply attached to a particular understanding of the role of the aesthetic within like the definition of art. And I mean, personally, I am interested more in art as a process that has like a really ambiguous relationship to instrumentalization. And I think on the one hand, it's very important to keep art sort of as a non-instrumentalizable like supplement to everything else that exists within very kind of goal-specific fields, and where there are very particular conditions within these fields that are either kind of commercially driven, market-driven, very specifically politically driven, and then art being this weird other thing that has other interests, but the other is always this open set to be defined. Of course, that's very slippery in many ways. That's the slipperiness of that formula is what got us into the current contemporary art moment. But I think one way to get out of that is to detach from the pure kind of spatio-temporal aesthetic experience thing of art, and to move into like deeper time scales, spatial understandings, like operational trickling across of art. So I guess that kind of moves into a slightly more esoteric territory, but I think that's a really important kind of legacy to revisit in terms of how are we kind of defining what is critical, and what are the components of that thing we call, or the thing, or the entity that is art. But then the kind of pragmatic side of things that we have given to you in this talk, it's about revisiting this sort of other side of the coin, the instrumental side of the coin, and to just basically say, well, everything is always already instrumentalized, because we're not these like autonomous plutonic forms that float in the universe and like have their own agencies and trajectories, right? Everybody is kind of embedded within systems, structures. We're all kind of interdependent. I think probably like, probably these are very kind of self-understood, clear things. But I feel that once we understand art from this like perspective interdependence, where we don't need to always have this kind of thing where like, but why is it art? Or like, what is it about that is art? Or what is it about that is aesthetic? But like understanding more as a process, like in constant formation in a wider network of processes. Like it just I feel it leads to very different, like maybe philosophy of why be an artist or practice as an artist. And when I use here the term artist, I also mean curator, or I also mean anyone who wants to be in the art field, precisely because there is this kind of lure of, false freedom. But that kind of lure of false freedom is also the leverage in entering into these much more schematized and instrumentalized sites in order to be this kind of weird agent that can potentially instill certain processes. And when I say agent, I don't mean just as an individual. I mean like as an agency art, like something that presents this artistic agency, whether it's a collective of 5 people, whether it's a sort of a corporate art organizational form with 500 people who are part of it, whether it's an automated art form that doesn't even have human agents. So yeah, so I guess this is like just a very long-winded way of like trying to not fall prey to one specific and like historically, I think, I don't want to say passe because that's just sounds judgmental in some way, but I kind of think it's passe definition of what the artist is. It's just like, what could it be like at this hybrid end? What more could it be?
Well, I think this is the kind of thing I've learned from the presentation and discussion. In a way, might get past the contradiction or dichotomy that I set up in my first question between like the critical model and the kind of pragmatic engagement reformist model that you're proposing. Because in a way, I think what's core in your presentation, or like what you want to move with, is that you're interested in technology, not just in terms of like what we can make with it, like, per object or per image and so on, but technology, especially digitech, is really at core the change of organization. It will change how we organize, and it not just organize institutions, but also organize, as we've learned through lockdown situations, will change how we organize sociality, how we organize conviviality, how we organize institutions, also meaning. And in a sense, that's kind of really the critical impulse, right? So the demand of critique is like, here's a set of received institutions and they need to be changed. So for me, that's the kind of convergence point between like the demands of historical critique as we received it, but also, you know, it's got to mutate away from skepticism around engaging with power and organizations towards kind of dealing with them in a way that is produces more just transformations or more just changes of organization, rather than let them run their course towards, you know, increased capitalization and concentrated wealth, for example, or, you know, data scraping surveillance models and so on. So I think that change of organization, maybe just paraphrasing what you're saying, Victoria, but the change of organization means that we don't necessarily need to look towards, you know, artists making something in a space as the kind of result of this type of the kind of engagement that you're calling for.
Yeah, maybe the example that I was thinking when as Victoria was speaking and is relevant to that point is, you know, in a basic way of like, what would it look like? What would it feel like? I mean, I would love to see like a company be formed from an artistic perspective, and to really show up like the kind of basic depressing like vision of the world that many of the technologies around us like produce right now. And I have faith that, you know, art as a field has the potential to do that. But what we've had historically is any example where that's happened, it's kind of been like a performance, and at the point of failure, it's like dragged back into the exhibition space and given primacy as like the potential of this like experiment of transformation. And I want to see like things go beyond that, because I think that it's possible.
Yeah, I guess no better way to end than setting some homework, which you've just done. That's good. I think we should. So we've pushed you both quite hard. It's like 2.5 hours we've been going, so I think we should stop. Thank you both. Thank you very much. We'll continue a version of this next week with rival strategies.
Yeah, actually, come to think of it, there's a great new book that came out that might be worth sort of, what is it called? It was, you know which one I mean.
Future Ecologies?
No, it's not this one. It's, oh God, just 1 second. Where is it? It's Technocrats of the Imagination. But it might be interesting in terms of the kind of more, because people were asking also about like examples and stuff, and it might be just a good thing to look into in terms of an alternative like history of art that kind of makes what we're discussing here feel a little bit more grounded rather than speculative, and like historically grounded.
Great, thank you. Okay. On behalf of everyone, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us, and thank you for your
having us. Okay.